Hello, everyone. My name is Sheryl Negash, class of 1982, Davenport College. I am honored to be the moderator of the first panel for the celebration of 50 years at Yale, for Yale College for women, and 150 years in the graduate and professional schools. When I was asked to do this first panel, I was really pleased to hear the topic that we were starting with, because making the world a better place is something that I talk about and think about and try to do every day. We did our planning for this event. We came up with questions. We were all eager because, as you know, Yale sends us out into the world thinking that we can really change the world, and that's what we strive to do. We were aspirational, we were hopeful, and then yesterday happened. And yesterday, as you know, was the verdict that came out in the Breonna Taylor case. And not only was her name not mentioned, there was no accountability for what happened to her, that she was murdered in her own home by her cops. And for me, that kind of changed everything. It stopped me in my tracks. Not that I was so surprised to hear it. We've been experiencing this for so long, but I was disappointed. And my initial reaction was, I don't want to talk about this stuff anymore. We've been talking forever, and we now need some action. But cooler heads prevailed, and I talked to some of my friends. And here we are, because this is really now even more of an opportunity to talk about this really important topic. And who more would I want to talk about it with than a group of Yale women in front of an audience of Yaleys who have influence in a variety of spheres in terms of where they work and where they live. And so this is a very, very important, very much needed conversation. So I am really honored to have an esteemed panel of Yale women join me. And I'm going to just introduce them by name and year, and I'm going to ask them to provide highlights about their background as we go through them. So first, I would like to introduce Pastor Kaji Douša. She's Yale Divinity, 2006. Dr. Sheryl Grills, Yale College, 1980. Carmelyn Malalis, Yale College, 96. Rahiel Tesfamariam, Divinity School, 09, and Diala Shamas, Yale College, 06, and JD, 2011. So I'm going to give you an order, and I'm going to ask you ladies to just introduce yourself, share some details about your experience working in the field of social justice. Sheryl, could you start?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cheryl Grills, and I'm a clinical psychologist by training. But I want to kind of share who I am in the context of how I've been involved in social justice and racial justice issues. So beginning in my graduate school training at UCLA in clinical psychology, I created my own specialized minor focused on issues of mental health and assessment for Black folk because of the absence of adequate attention to those issues and the deficit model and everything that we were being taught. From there to launching an applied research organization focused on social justice issues that support community-based organizations that are involved in community organizing on a host of social justice issues. Moving on from there, still have that organization, by the way, but also then getting involved in social justice issues with what we call the justice system. I'm a commissioner in Los Angeles County, and I inspect the jails and the lockup facilities, until recently also included juveniles. I've been working on issues related to disproportionality in the child welfare system in Los Angeles County. And lastly, during my tenure as president of the Association of Black Psychologists, I was able to forge a relationship between our association and the Community Healing Network, which was founded by a Yale alum, Yale Law School alum, Enola Aird, and we're focused on emotional emancipation for people of African ancestry around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here on this panel. So my name is Diala Shamas, and I'm a staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is based in New York, although I'm currently speaking to you from East Jerusalem. So I thought I'd just speak about how I've come to do this work. My own work is really deeply rooted in where I'm from. So I'm Palestinian. I came to the US, to Yale actually, from Palestine, where I had grown up under military occupation. And it was in law school in the US that I became drawn to the way in which the so-called national security or terrorism framework was deployed against groups. So in a post 9/11 America, that was Muslim communities. And that resonated with me because I was familiar with what happens when your people are framed as terrorists by the state, and when state authorities claim enforcement powers or their authority to use violence when you're viewed as dangerous or criminal. And so that interest set me on a particular career path. Out of law school for years, I worked alongside Muslim communities in pushing back against the application of the terrorism framework to them, whether through surveillance of their spaces, places of worship, and also pursuing accountability with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies for abusing the authorities that they've claimed under the name of national security. And so many of the things that I'd hear from my clients, the personal details of the experiences of what it felt like to have that knock on your door, say by the FBI, to have to constantly watch what you say, to be viewed with suspicion by the state, all resonated with me. And mind you that we were then talking about New York City in 2011, Obama era New York City, right? And just something, turning to this moment really quickly, as we all reel from yesterday's decision in Breonna Taylor's case and have watched another night of protests in opposition to the devaluing of Black life, we're seeing how a lot of these same authorities are deployed against Black protests or the Black-led protest movement against police violence, demanding accountability. So I see my own work as a lawyer as lending my legal skills to support those who are bearing the brunt of that state force, whether it's in the US or in Palestine. And in this moment, really weighing heavily on me is the need to be doing that in the US.
Great, thank you.
So my name is Carmelyn P. Malalis. I am a Yale graduate from '96. I was a proud women's studies major at Yale. And I always say that because I have many memories of my father, talking to me and my other women's studies friends, companions, and kind of just shaking his head saying, I don't know how you girls are going to get a job. What are you going to do with that? So I always like to recall that because there are several people in my program who are doing and continue to do amazing things. So I am the chair and commissioner for the New York City Commission on Human Rights. That is the city agency in New York City that enforces all of the city's anti-discrimination and anti-harassment protections across the city. Anywhere you live, breathe, work, exist in New York City, our laws protect you. And we are widely thought to have one of the most protective human rights / civil rights laws in the country, let alone the world. One is because of the sheer number of protections we have in New York City. Right now, there's 27 categories of protection. But also there's just, New York City being what it is, being a city of strangers coming together, being a city of diverse cultures, there is such a will for us to be inclusive and to put forth our best foot forward. I came into this in February of 2015. And my background is that my parents are immigrants from the Philippines. They came here in the late 1960s. They are Filipino Catholics, and so their first objective was to find a good kind of Catholic town for us to grow up in. And they chose a place that was predominantly Italian, Irish, Polish, Catholic, which basically meant that for years, my sister and I would be chased in playgrounds being told to go back to Puerto Rico, or with kids kind of slanting their eyes and calling us names. And I say that because from very early on, the concept of being different and the concept of, identity was very strong for me and for my family. And so, with that in mind, I'd always kind of sought things to bring me into the area of human rights. Prior to coming into government, my background was as an employment lawyer, representing workers in all types of workers' rights related actions. And when I was first called about coming into city government, the idea of opening up city government to many different communities that have for such a long time been considered invisible or at odds with government was very compelling to me. So many things come through at the local level. Like, I think a lot of times there's a focus on social justice issues or human rights issues at a federal level, but basic issues like education, food, housing, these types of stabilizing forces all come through at the local level. And so I was very excited to take on this work and to really focus on communities that had, I think in the past, either had bad relationships with government or had no relationships with government because of things like over-policing or being surveilled or things of that nature. And so that is very much how I come to the work that I do. If there is a community that generally is suspicious of government, those are the communities that we need to be in. We need to make sure that those are the communities that are not cut off from resources or from the knowledge of what their rights and protections are. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation because I think I'm coming at it from a very local perspective.
Great, thank you. Rahiel, are you there?
Yes, can you see me and hear me?
I can hear you. I can't quite see you yet. There you are. Okay,
so
thank
now
you.
Okay. We had some technical difficulties, but I'm glad to be on. So am I introducing myself at this point?
Yeah, just to give us a brief overview of your background in relation to social justice.
Okay.
Everyone already has the bios, they're in the program, so we don't want to give the full bio.
Of course. So I always tell people that my commitment to justice has really been lifelong. And it has a lot to do with the areas I've lived and been raised in. In Asmata, Eritrea, in the South Bronx, in Washington, D.C. during the crack epidemic. And I went from places that were war-torn and dealing with a lot of socioeconomic disparities to lead institutions like Stanford and Yale. And so I always talk about how this dichotomy of existence, or what Du Bois called double consciousness, made me very aware of racial and class identity in a way in which I knew that I didn't have the privilege of pretending like I didn't see all of these injustices around me on a daily basis. Not just something that I watched on television, but something that I saw when the young men that I went to school with were going to jail. And they were going to jail at alarming numbers. And so at the time, I didn't have the language for mass incarceration, but I knew young men that I was friends with and loved were being imprisoned. I didn't have the language for, economic disparities, but I knew the immigrants and the women living around me were housekeepers and taxi drivers and, underpaid. And so I saw these disparities, and that was always my entry point into justice, and it continues to be. It's not necessarily, a sense that I'm an organizer and I'm an activist. It's the idea that I'm fighting for the survival and the betterment of the people who are near and dear to me. So I feel that, as I always say, some of us kind of sign up and others of us are born into the struggle. And so I definitely believe that I'm born into the struggle. The one thing I would point out is I did return from living on the continent the last 3 years, from essentially the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated to 1 year ago in 2019. And I think those 3 years of kind of living as an outsider, watching the United States from abroad, and listening to people talk about how they see American democracy, to hear people laughing on a daily basis about who our current president is, and kind of seeing what the brand of America had become throughout the world. It has absolutely shaped how I've returned, and now how I see politics in the United States and these current issues that we have of racial justice.
Thank you, Rahiel. Let me try one more time with Kaji. Do we have you, Kaji? Okay. I know they're working on it, and they'll get her in as soon as they can. But I'm honored to be on this panel with all of you. You come with such diverse backgrounds, all looking at the same types of problems, though. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to ask the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can as we finish the presentation. But I'm going to throw out a question that a lot of people are asking at this moment. Do Black Lives Matter? Based on what's going on in the United States and around the world at this moment. And I'm going to ask Cheryl to be the first to respond to that question.
Okay, so let me start with the following. The first thing I would like to mention is that there must be a recognition on the part of everybody in this nation that America is still a racist country. Now, however unpleasant that sounds, it is the truth. And we will never solve the problem of racism until there is a recognition of the fact that racism still stands at the center of so much of our nation. And we must see racism for what it is. It's the notion that one group has all the knowledge, all of the insights, all of the purity, all of the work, all of the dignity. And another group is worthless, on a lower level of humanity, inferior. Racism is based on an ontological affirmation. Now, here's the punchline. Those were not my words. Those are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968 at a speech he made at Grosse Pointe High School. But it speaks to the heart of the matter, that not only are we facing racism, we're facing racism in such a way that it reflects the fact that Black lives don't matter because we are dealing with a deadly mindset. And that deadly mindset has to do with what we consider the root cause. And when I say we, I'm talking about Community Healing Network and Loyola and the Association of Black Psychologists. The root cause of the devaluing of Black lives is this notion of white superiority and Black inferiority. Until we deal with that, Black lives do not matter in the United States. And in fact, Black lives don't matter in the global village.
Wow, thank you. Speaking of the global village, Rahiel, you've worked outside of the country as well as inside of the country. Would you field that question for me? Do Black lives matter?
Well, first I want to thank Sheryl for her comment about the global village, because I think in the United States, we often operate in this realm of American exceptionalism, not just in the sense that we're the only ones that are great, but we also forget that we're not the only ones that are struggling. And so it's important to always situate the struggle for liberation in a global context. So I thank you for that. And I refuse to get into a debate about whether or not Black Lives Matter. I think that every struggle, every liberation effort has always had a mantra, a slogan that empowers the people, be it Alusa Continua, be it Amanla Awetu, be it Black Power, every era, every people from Palestine on. Everyone has a mantra for their liberation. But we have to be careful that it doesn't become a force of distraction. And anytime we find ourselves in debates about whether or not Black Lives Matter or all lives matter, and whether or not we have to create memes to explain it to white folks, then we have simply allowed ourselves to be manipulated by the forces of white supremacy, because white supremacy will always act as a force of distraction. And so we get so caught up explaining Black Lives Matter, justifying it, creating space for it to even be said, that we don't deal with the real truth, which is the fact that all these other nations throughout the world have been settler colonial states that have invaded the lands of African countries and indigenous lands all over the world. I mean, we know the European superpowers have always done that. The difference with the United States is that it has disconnected its identity as a colonial power. It has disconnected itself from this identity of being imperialistic, of being slave catchers. And because it has told lies throughout centuries of what this country is, then we have to deal with the basics of demanding that our humanity be recognized, right? And so anyone who wants to engage in that conversation, I encourage you to withdraw yourself from it and say that I refuse to engage in a debate or a conversation. I refuse to minimize this liberation struggle to a phrase. But what we're really talking about is whether or not the United States is a white supremacist nation. It has always been from its founding days. Has it ever humanized Black people, indigenous people? No. But is it a nation of immigrants? And is this nation built on the Blacks of enslaved Africans? Is it built on the Blacks of red people, yellow people? Yes, absolutely, right? And so we have to be honest about the fact that America values our labor, but not our lives. And so this disconnect from our productivity, but yet not a valuing of our intrinsic worth, right? That's what we have to talk about. And truly, honestly, the economic and capitalistic ways in which America has valued Black life is what we have to acknowledge, right? Because our productivity has always been of value. Our capital has always been of value, but the justice has not equated into that.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. You know, we don't want to have to get engaged in these conversations about our common humanity. So appreciate that sentiment. I think, Kaji, are you with us now?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Let me ask you to do two things. Just introduce yourself, you know, tell us about your work in social justice, and then let us know what your response would be if I were to ask you that same question. We've heard from Sheryl and Rahiel.
Absolutely, and I would echo so much of what's already been said. My name is Kaji Douša. I'm senior pastor of the Park Avenue Christian Church here in Manhattan, New York City, and I graduated from Yale Divinity School in 2006, I think. And I'm grateful to be able to join you. I know many of the people who are on the call. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, so just want to make sure anybody who has a chance to mute is. But anyway, so I'm pastor of the church here in the city, and we are a multicultural, multiracial church which holds a Black womanist theology. And we are rooted in a liberationist perspective. So this is a community that is really trying to be, in these multi-pandemic times, relevant to all the ways that life is challenged, including through systemic racism and anti-immigrant policies. As I'm also co-chair of the New Sanctuary Coalition, which basically stops deportation. And this is work that we've been doing for over 10 years. And so those are my general foci as a pastor and as an activist here in the city. And because of this work, for example, the US government has targeted me personally. I found myself through a whistleblower to be on a secret government watch list of people who have been claimed to be Antifa and other things, so that I and many others lost certain forms of travel privileges and am now engaged in litigation with the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and also Customs and Border Patrol over this specific targeting of dissidents. And I have my own case because I'm the only pastor on this list of 59 activist journalists and attorneys who support immigrants at the border, but also, so we have First Amendment claims, we also have religious freedom claims, which is why we're in our own lawsuit. So feel free to look up Douša v. DHS. But that's a little bit about who I am. And then just to briefly answer your question, because it was very well answered by others, especially Rahiel, as we hold so many similar perspectives. But so I think prepositions matter. So I think you asked, do Black lives matter in the United States? I would say, yes, Black lives matter in the United States. They matter to me. They matter to some Black people and even to other racial groups. But I think it's important to note that as a matter of my faith, Black lives absolutely matter to God, who has already chosen sides in the struggle of the oppressed. And I think what I would say is that I would nuance this to say that do Black lives matter to the U.S. to versus in is a different question. And to that, I would say, and forgive my language, hell no. Breonna Taylor's walls wound up mattering more than her own life. And I think as we see white supremacy flexing more and more with impunity, that traditionally white institutions, including Yale, will have to do a whole lot more to reverse the power that we see in all these gentlemen's networks that we each are part of and participate in various ways. Are going to have to wrestle with what they're willing to give up for Black lives to be able to matter, because it's not a sign. It's a shift. And that shift, I don't think, has quite happened, but I'm sure we'll talk more about that in a bit. That's all I have to say for now.
Great. Just going to ask, since you are in another country at this moment, Diala, and there has been a lot of support for the protests for police brutality. Could you tell us if you believe at this point what you see happening now is going to make a difference in terms of us actually achieving a more just world?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, and it's really great to hear everyone speak. I don't have much more to add. The Palestinian solidarity with the Black protests in the U.S. has a very long history, and that solidarity has gone both ways. And it's one of these sort of stark reminders of how these are truly global issues. So thank you, Rahiel and Kaji, for raising the sort of global aspect of racism, and also for talking about the root causes as really the lens through which we should be examining this, and also really elevating that, when we think about solutions, let's think about institutions and the institutions that we have access to. So thank you all for those comments. In terms of whether we can see sort of change around the corner, I think that the history of racism is obviously a very long one in the US, and we see these moments happening in cycles. But I think we're also seeing time just, whatever the word is, crunch into itself in this moment. So in both directions, in all directions. So in the span of 4 years, we'll have seen probably 3 new Supreme Court justices, normalization of bans and borders and children in cages. We've seen alarming levels of collaboration between police and white supremacist militias and groups, literally right now in the streets in Portland. But the potential is also huge, and we're seeing transformations at every level of society and conversations in places that we didn't see before, right? And we're seeing a true reckoning with white supremacy at institutions where, including at Yale, right? When I would have gotten laughed out of the classroom 10 years ago in law school, if I uttered the words white supremacy and been dismissed as a sort of radical lefty, right? Which I would be proud to be dismissed as, but just to kind of help us trace, the sort of long history or how fast things are moving. What I'm most heartened by, though, is movement calls to question how money is spent, right? And that we're seeing a lot of that, and we're seeing that those questions be raised really sharply, led by Black organizers, Black thinkers, and advocates who've been doing this for years, that are really kind of gaining traction now in a way where the calls to defunding ICE, defunding the police are headlines, are at every protest. So they're calling us to look at our budgets, right? Whether it's police budgets, whether it's ICE budgets, whether it's military budgets. And that tells us a lot about what we prioritize and where we want to be seeing change happen. So those are some of the things that give me hope. And those are some of the things that make me feel like the movements underway are going we're already seeing the kind of traction that we haven't seen in a really long time. I think what we do know, though, a warning is that these efforts for incremental reforms have not worked, right? So as lawyers, guilty as charged, and as members of elite institutions, we're often taught that there's strategic value, that there's respectability in aiming for policy fixes that are oftentimes compromises. And there's a move away from, and urging us to move away from, more transformative questions. And so I think that we're not in that moment anymore. I'm seeing it everywhere at all institutions, and I hope we're seeing it also at Yale. And that's where I draw hope from.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Carmelyn, let me ask you a question, because you are in a unique position in that you're working within a system which is trying to also make sure that the systems that they are working with are doing the right thing. There in New York City, there's been a lot going on. You all have been at the forefront of a lot of the social justice action. And I'd just like to give you an opportunity to respond to the question of, is it possible for us to change things within systems, or do we really need to just do what people are suggesting now, tear down the systems and start again?
Right. I'm a huge fan of the both and approach. And certainly I think the fact that I've been in government now since, for the last 5+ years, kind of indicates that either I don't know what I'm doing being here, or I do believe that, there has to be some sort of inside-outside approach. I think, going back to what Diala was just saying, when you look at government, whether you look at government on the federal level or you look at it on a city level, you see the ways in which different governments prioritize different offices and different entities. Somebody in the Q&A I saw asked, why is New York City so thoroughly segregated in housing and education, despite the fact that it has such progressive human rights laws? And this is what we really need to get at in government. Some of us try to get at in government by being within. Some of us are doing that from the outside. But I think this goes to exactly it. Why? Because government for such a long time, historically, at every level of government, has really feared attacking the root causes of of racial discrimination and the underlying question here: do Black lives matter? For the most part, they haven't mattered, and that's because largely the fear at the government level of talking about those issues, about taking on those issues, about disturbing, the status quo in these situations. I used to talk about coming into government and feeling like there was somebody there with a little lever and saying, I'm making cheese, and you're looking at the other side, what's coming out, and you see sausage, and you say, hey, that's not cheese, that's sausage. That's government at every level. And it takes people, I think, disrupting it from the inside as well as from the outside, say, this can't be. We can't have this happening anymore. If you can't have government officials talking about over-policing, if you can't have government officials talking about surveillance, you have a real problem. You're not going to solve anything. So much of a challenge for me is that I am government. So one of the challenges, I think, for me or for anyone in government is getting community to believe in you. And that is a challenge, but that is a challenge that government has earned so hard by its complete and utter historic failures. When I talk to my office and we go out into public, Kaji and Diala are in New York City, so they have more of a sense probably of my office. We're out there and we say, thank you for going out on a limb and trusting us enough with your time to think that there's actually somebody here who wants to make real change, right? takes questioning why is it that it's so easy to take away children from Black families in the child welfare system? Why are there such health disparities when a pandemic happens? Why is it when a Black man is bird watching in Central Park, it is so easy to weaponize the police force? So I think if we don't have people within government questioning it from the inside and institutionally saying, we can't do this anymore, this is not okay, but it will take far longer. And I say that just as somebody who marvels at and now has much more of an understanding of the power of, of the status quo in government structures.
May I jump in? Would it be possible to jump in? Oh, thank you. Just because I'm so passionate about New York City, but I think it's an interesting sort of microcosm of assessing how government and how structures are functioning. But I'll also point out that a big chunk, so in terms of like the interplay between the activist movement and also, people who are within the structures, a big chunk of the current administration came out, and also really recent administrators came out against certain policies and really were trying to bring the city into account to say, there are things that have worked really well and there are things that haven't. And I think across, without naming names, across all government administration and major structures, we are seeing the institutional failures of entrusting straight, cis, hetero, white men with all this power who are not necessarily willing to give up and learn from the people who surround them with better ideas and ways of being able to protect others. And so the structures, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, are showing just how much when we don't have really massively built up structures that hear from different voices and are required to listen to them, we will fall into these patterns of failure.
So that brings me to the next question. So what do? We have an audience full of young women here. All of us are probably tuning in because we want to do something. We want to be able to make a difference. How do we fix this? And I'm going to let anybody who wants to jump in right now. Cheryl, I don't think we've heard from you in a while, so I'm going to put you on the spot to start.
Okay. So let me start by saying that in this moment, America still has trouble telling the truth and reckoning itself with that truth, which makes me I'll put it this way, I'm skeptically optimistic about any kind of change that may be coming forward. America, especially white America, has a shameful lack of knowledge about the reality of Black life in American history. And then in the past, when we have seen some advances made, for example, during the Civil Rights Movement, the discovery of the brutal reality and the facts of segregated life came as a result of Black folk educating the nation by dramatizing the evils of nonviolent through nonviolent protests. Our laws, our political scientists and social scientists, et cetera, played little or no role in disclosing the truth. And so for generations, America has taught its children and reified in its movies and books a glorious myth about the origins of this country and its greatness, ignoring that it lied, it stole, it killed, it trafficked human bodies and souls, it enslaved, it colonized, it terrorized, it disenfranchised, and it committed genocide against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. There's got to be a reckoning with that. There's got to be a come to Jesus moment, if you will, on the truth. And in addition to that, there is some research that suggests just knowing the truth, gaining knowledge, is not enough to change the attitudes of people. So we've got to do other kind of work, internal work, some serious, hardcore self-reflection about what are my attitudes and my stereotypes and my prejudices? How do I contribute to the inequities in society? How do I contribute to the hurt meted out against people of color, meted out against Black folk? And then how do I begin to be part of a solution that starts with my affinity group? Every so-called racial group in this country needs to go inside and as a group look at how it has contributed to, bought into, operates from the racial narrative in this country. And do some soul searching and do the hard work of emancipating themselves from the lies we've told ourselves for generations. And then from there, go back to, now what can we do legislatively? Because if you look at all of the laws and constitutional amendments, they have not saved us. Presidential proclamation, they have not saved us. We are still where we were at when we first got here in terms of Black folk. Native Americans are in a horrible state of affairs. And so, what do we have to do? We got a lot of work to do, but I'd say reckoning with the is a place to start.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more person to respond to that question because I want to get to some of the questions from the chat and we are quickly running out of time. So
I'm happy to offer a response if you're up for it.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things we also need to reckon with, and I agree on this assault on truth and truth telling, is also that we face this crisis of imagination where we go for these little bits and crumbs that are left on the floor for us. And that's true for Black people. It is true for people of color in general, whatever that phrase means. It's true for so many of the groups that we care about and are talking about today. And yet, if we were to take a step back and just sort of liberate ourselves from the shackles of, as Dr. Towns, Emily Towns says, the phantasms of hegemonic imagination that teach us to think very small and not to imagine beyond how we operate and what we've seen before, then we can sort of just dismantle and to dissipate those phantasms and imagine something quite larger than anything that they've taught us was possible. And all of that is when revolution happens, which is, protest is not going to lead to the kind of overturning that we're talking about. It will be revolution. And what our hope is that it'll be a revolution of love and not the revolution that seems to be threatening itself depending on what happens on November 3rd. That's a small thinking revolution to maintain a certain form of supremacy and to keep power within a very small number of hands. But what if we actually believed that there were a different way, which we believe there is? There's been plenty of leadership on this, and we just need to rethink what we believe could be possible if we could just tap into the hearts of people and the deepest needs and desires of their hearts, and to see the commonality across that needs to give up on a few things of privilege, but also sharing it for the sake of a kind of equality that I am not that familiar with happening, but I still believe could be possible. Yale thinkers, I think, have to be right on the forefront of that because we are on the forefront. And if we're not, then what we're doing is we're just upholding major structural problems.
Great. I'll take one more comment. Thank you, Kaji. And then I'm going to go to the questions.
Okay, I'd like to jump in.
Go ahead.
So, I can't help but think about this question in a theological context because, one question that I think a lot of us have been asking is, where is God in all of this? Not just all of this as in this moment, but, in terms of 400 years of suffering and subjugation that people of color in this country have endured, and how reminiscent it is of the story of the children of Israel in the Bible. So one thing that I have found in my searching in the text for clues and answers of where God is and what God might be saying is that a lot of the work that God does is generational. And a lot of the work that God calls us to do is generational. So how we operate in this context of movements and moments, God is looking in the context of generations. And so one thing that I would compel us to think about is what is the particular call on our lives in terms of doing generational work? Because we can so quickly be hypnotized by what we see in mainstream media. So that if today the media is talking about food justice, that's what we're passionate about. Tomorrow, if the media is talking about climate change, that's what we're talking about. And so the media is directing our everyday steps in a form of almost hypnotism, right? And so we're responding to mind control and not even aware of it. But the problem with that is that we're not responding to the issues that are breaking our hearts immediately in our communities. We're not responding to the things that anger us. You know, if your father has been incarcerated for 20 years, and mass incarceration is at your heart, maybe that's something you're called to deal with, right? And maybe you need to stay on that issue for as long as you can. And maybe we need you to write about it, talk about it, fight for it. The problem is when you have a generation that's being led by hashtags and trends, so nobody has a sustained focus on any issue, right? And so what I'm compelling us to do is balance this involvement in what's happening in the mainstream with the fact that we all have personal, individual, and when I say collective, we have communal needs that have to be met, right? And so think about what makes you come alive. When I speak, I ask people to think about that. What makes you come alive? What is that issue that burns in your heart? And there are particular chains that you are called to break, right? When we talk about the breaking of strongholds and we talk about liberation, we're not talking about an amorphous thing. We're talking about the fact that you've gone through particular struggles in your life, and there are ways that you can speak to that in ways that no one else can. And the last thing that I would say is, what community are you called to serve? Because for a lot of white folks try to figure out how to jump in, your greatest level of influence might be around a bunch of other white folks who might need to be taught by you, led by you, have their minds expanded by you, right? And so my encouragement is that we pull into the inward, because everything in mainstream media is causing us to look outward. And we gotta have that inward and outward focus to do this work.
Terry, can I quickly, I know we're trying to move on, but I just have to quickly on this. You know, so much I think of what Rahiel was talking about is, you know, the call to action, right? So if the question is, what should people be doing? What's that call to action? It's you have to actually do something. Meaning that, you know, it's great to post things on Twitter and to post things on Instagram. The visibility, is fantastic. It's great to get the visibility on that. And it's great to keep minds working on that. But we are living at a time where the stakes are so high. We are all called to do more than what we have been comfortable doing, to do more what we have done in the past. And so that means, you know, stepping out of your comfort zone to figure out what that is. If today, as Rahiel was saying, if today's about food insecurity, maybe you're donating to a food bank. Oh, maybe you're going to that food bank to work at it. If it's another issue, if it's voting, it's writing letters, it's drafting things, actually putting something behind that. And it's also realizing that the issues of today are people. There are lives lost on the issues that we're talking about today. They're not just things that come and go because it's trending on Twitter that hour or that day. I'm tired of seeing all these memes about like follow Black women or follow women, except I guess when they run for president or vice president or when the leadership really matters. Why is that?
Right.
So that's the call to actually act, do things. There is no, sometimes I feel like it's the issue of when people say, oh, pipeline issues. I don't see, there's not enough Black lawyers. There's not enough queer whatever or not. Same thing with the action. We are surrounded by requests and asks, demands, do things in order to right the wrongs, in order to actually stand up for people that we don't know. We have to answer those calls. People must act.
Right. Thank you. So we have about 4 minutes left. You did a great job because many of you responded to the questions that were coming in the chat box as you were speaking, so I appreciate that. I'm going to ask you to just give like one sentence that you want people to leave with. What do you want them to take away from this talk that we've had here today? We will keep the questions in the chat. Hopefully we will be able to get back to them for future events and delve into them much more deeply. But what's your parting thought? I'm going to ask Rahiel to start. One sentence. Can't hear you.
Muted. It's not actually my words, but it's one of my favorite. One sentence is going to be 2 quotes that ground every single thing that I do, and they're very short. And it's one is, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. That is one. And the other one is, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is tied up in mine, then let's do some work.
Thank you. Carmelyn.
I'm probably responding to, the loss of RBG so recently and so suddenly for all of us. I'm just going to say it is not over. We cannot act like it is.
Fantastic. Thank you. Cheryl.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote. To lose illusions is to gain truth. So educate yourselves. And even though that is not enough, I'll add, do some civic engagement, do some self and affinity group work, get involved in action for meaningful, lasting social change, and get in some good trouble.
Fantastic. Diala.
These are all great. So don't, always question power, and there's always something that you can do where you are right now. Question fundamentally the institutions that you have access to, and don't be disillusioned in what feels like there's just so much going on right now, but there's also so much that can be done.
Great, thank you. Kaji.
I'd love to quote St. Pauli Murray, and as President Salovey wrote in his reflection after George Floyd had died, she said, or they said, as an American, I inherit the magnificent tradition of an endless march toward the freedom and toward the dignity of all humankind. And you know what I want to say is that I agree with St. Pauli, but I also do not want to be on an endless march. It's time for a revolution.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for our panelists. You did a great job. We knew we didn't have enough time to really get into these topics very deeply, but we appreciate it. The thought processes have started, and we have more to talk about. I want to thank Wendy Maldonado, Amico, Jane Cruz, Michelle Raza, Nicholas Lewis for organizing this and supporting us through this. And I want to thank everybody else for tuning in. Let's make this the beginning of some meaningful discussion. Let's keep ourselves encouraged, and let's go on until we really do actually have a revolution. Thanks, everybody. Hopefully, we will see some real progress very soon.